During World War II, some of the most important decisions were never explained to the public, not because they were secret forever, but because they were inconvenient at the time. Generals made choices that contradicted their public statements. Political leaders authorized operations they later questioned in private. Strategic decisions that appeared confident and decisive were, in reality, surrounded by uncertainty, disagreement, and risk. Decades later, when wartime archives were opened, historians discovered that many of the explanations people accepted during the war were only partial. Some were simplified. Others avoided uncomfortable details entirely. This is not about conspiracy theories. It is about wartime secrecy, political necessity, and the gap between what leaders said publicly and what they recorded privately in classified documents. During World War II, information control was not an exception. It was standard practice. Governments censored reports, managed public expectations, and carefully shaped narratives. Morale, alliance cohesion, and operational security all depended on controlling what the public knew and when they knew it. After the war, that control slowly loosened. Some documents were released after 20 years. Others took 50. Some were not fully accessible until the Cold War ended. When historians began comparing internal memoranda, planning files, and after-action reports with wartime public statements, they found important discrepancies. One of the clearest examples is the Allied raid on Dieppe in August 1942. Nearly 6,000 troops took part, most of them Canadian. The operation was intended to seize the German-occupied port temporarily, gather intelligence, and withdraw. Instead, it became a catastrophe. Within hours, German defenses overwhelmed the attackers. Tanks were unable to move off the beach. Air support failed to neutralize enemy positions. By the end of the day, almost 60% of the Canadian force had been killed, wounded, or captured. At the time, the official explanation was straightforward. British leaders described Dieppe as a reconnaissance in force, a costly operation, but a necessary one. The lessons learned, the public was told, would make future amphibious landings possible. This interpretation became widely accepted and was repeated for decades. When internal British and Canadian documents were declassified years later, a different picture emerged. Planning assessments written shortly after the raid acknowledged serious flaws. Intelligence on German defenses had been incomplete. Objectives were unclear even within the command structure. Some officers had expressed doubts before the operation, warning that the risks outweighed the potential benefits. These concerns were either minimized or overridden. Later historical analysis of the archival material showed that many of the lessons attributed to Dieppe could have been learned without committing such a large force. The scale of the operation suggested ambitions that were never clearly defined in writing. What was presented publicly as a deliberate test increasingly appeared in the archival record as a poorly coordinated gamble. Why was this not explained at the time? In 1942, the Allies were under extreme pressure. The Soviet Union demanded a second front. Britain needed to demonstrate offensive capability. Canada needed reassurance that its forces were being used effectively. Publicly acknowledging planning failures would have weakened confidence at a moment when confidence itself was a strategic resource. A simplified explanation was safer. The fuller truth emerged only when the war and the political pressures surrounding it were long over. Another case where the archival record tells a more complicated story involves the decision not to bomb Auschwitz. From 1942 onward, Allied governments received reports about mass killings at Auschwitz-Birkenau. By 1944, Jewish organizations and resistance groups formally requested that the Allies bomb the rail lines leading to the camp or the killing facilities themselves. The Allies did not carry out those strikes. At the time, there was no public explanation. The issue was not addressed in press briefings or official statements. It remained largely absent from wartime public discourse. When American and British files were declassified decades later, historians discovered that the issue had been discussed extensively behind closed doors. In June 1944, the U.S. War Refugee Board formally requested an air attack on Auschwitz. The War Department rejected the proposal, stating in internal memoranda that such operations were not feasible and would divert resources from decisive military objectives. However, later archival research added important context. Allied aircraft bombed industrial targets only a few miles from Auschwitz later that same year. Aerial photographs taken during those missions clearly showed the camp complex. British Foreign Office documents released years later revealed additional concerns. Officials worried about the political consequences of bombing a site that might contain Allied prisoners. There were fears about civilian casualties, operational failure, and public backlash if the mission did not achieve its intended result. The archival record shows that the decision involved more than military feasibility. Political considerations played a significant role, but those considerations were never communicated publicly. Explaining the decision at the time would have required acknowledging the full scale of the Holocaust while the war was still ongoing. Allied governments feared that such acknowledgement could complicate public support, provoke accusations of fighting a war for specific groups, and expose uncomfortable trade-offs between military priorities and humanitarian intervention. These realities were easier to avoid than to explain. Only with time did the full documentary record become available. If this kind of archival analysis helps you understand World War II more clearly, consider subscribing to WWII, Why It Happened. This channel focuses on why decisions were made, not just what happened. A third example involves the Soviet Union's delayed entry into the war against Japan. In April 1941, the Soviet Union and Japan signed a neutrality pact. Despite fighting a brutal war against Germany, the USSR did not declare war on Japan until August 1945, just days before Japan's surrender. Publicly, Soviet neutrality in the Pacific was explained as a necessity. The Red Army was fully committed in Europe and could not fight on two fronts. After the war, Soviet accounts emphasized the decisive impact of the August 1945 invasion of Manchuria. Declassified diplomatic records reveal a more calculated strategy. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, American and British leaders negotiated directly with Stalin for Soviet entry into the Pacific War. In exchange, the USSR received territorial concessions in East Asia and expanded influence in the region. These agreements were not disclosed to the public during the war. Soviet military planning documents released after the collapse of the USSR show that preparations for war with Japan had begun months earlier. The timing of the offensive was carefully chosen to maximize political and territorial gains while minimizing risk. Japanese diplomatic communications, intercepted during the war but fully analyzed later, show that Tokyo viewed potential Soviet intervention as a critical threat, possibly more destabilizing than continued American bombing. Why were these negotiations and calculations not explained at the time? The Allied coalition depended on unity. Publicly revealing territorial deals and competing post-war ambitions would have strained cooperation. Once Japan surrendered, attention shifted quickly to occupation and reconstruction. There was little incentive to revisit wartime diplomacy in detail. Across all these cases, similar patterns emerge. Governments prioritize morale over transparency. Alliance politics encourage silence. Operational uncertainty made clear explanations difficult. Political risk made honesty dangerous. These are not excuses. They are documented realities. World War II was not fought with perfect clarity. It was fought by leaders making decisions under extreme pressure, with limited information and conflicting priorities. Archives matter because they allow us to see that reality, not mythology, not propaganda, but history as it was actually experienced. Dieppe was more than a lesson. Auschwitz was more than a technical question. Soviet entry into the Pacific War was more than a sudden decision. Each case reflects choices that leaders found easier to make than to explain. Understanding those choices does not diminish the sacrifices of those who fought. It deepens our understanding of the war itself. So here is a question worth asking. Which wartime decision do you think history still misunderstands? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you found this analysis valuable, like the video and subscribe to WWII, Why It Happened. We will continue examining the documented record, the decisions behind it, and the explanations that came far too late.